What if I told you that the very qualities Americans celebrated in their democracy, the passion for equality, the strength of majority opinion, the leveling of social distinctions, contained within them the seeds of a peculiar form of tyranny? A tyranny more insidious than any monarch's oppression because it would emerge from the people themselves, wearing the mask of democratic legitimacy. During my journey through America in the 1830s, I witnessed a young democracy intoxicated with its own promise of equality and freedom. Yet beneath this enthusiasm, I detected something troubling: the emergence of forces that could transform democratic virtue into democratic vice. The very mechanisms that made American democracy remarkable, majority rule, social equality, democratic participation, carried within them the potential for a new kind of despotism. Today, America faces exactly what I foresaw: a democracy where the majorities will become so overwhelming that it silences dissent, where the pursuit of equality crushes individual excellence, where conformity masquerades as consensus. This is not the collapse of democracy, it is democracy consuming itself from within. Chapter 1: The Tyranny of Public Opinion, when the majority becomes an absolute sovereign. In aristocratic societies, tyranny required armies and prisons. In democratic America, I discovered something far more subtle and perhaps more complete: the tyranny of public opinion. Here, the majority doesn't need physical force to crush opposition, it simply renders dissenting voices irrelevant through the sheer weight of collective disapproval. I observed how Americans, despite their formal freedoms, exhibited remarkable conformity in their thoughts and expressions. A man might legally have the right to speak against prevailing opinion, but the social pressure to conform was so intense that few dared exercise this right. The majority doesn't say to the minority, "You shall think as I do or you shall die," but rather, "You are free to think differently, but from this day forth you are a stranger among us." This democratic tyranny operates through mechanisms unknown to traditional despotism. Where kings silenced opposition through execution or exile, democratic majorities accomplished the same through social ostracism, economic boycotts, and moral condemnation. The dissenter finds himself cut off from his fellow citizens, excluded from positions of influence, and treated as a pariah in his own country. The power of this social tyranny became evident to me in how Americans discussed slavery, political parties, and social customs. Those who held minority views learned to remain silent or face social suicide. This wasn't formal censorship, it was something more insidious: the voluntary self-silencing that occurs when individuals recognize the futility of opposing the majority's settled opinion. In my time, I saw how this dynamic played out in American politics and society. Political candidates who deviated too far from popular sentiment found themselves abandoned by voters who valued conformity over principle. Intellectuals and writers who challenged prevailing orthodoxies discovered that their audiences simply melted away. The marketplace of ideas, theoretically open to all, became dominated by those who told the majority what it wanted to hear. This tyranny of public opinion represents democracy's dark genius. It creates the illusion of freedom while ensuring conformity. Citizens believe themselves free because no law constrains their thoughts, yet they think within boundaries more rigid than any law could establish. The majority rules not just politically but intellectually and morally, creating a society where diversity of thought withers despite formal protections for free expression. Chapter 2: The Equality Trap: How Democratic Leveling Destroys Excellence. Americans' passion for equality, which I initially admired as a noble democratic impulse, reveals itself as a double-edged sword that can cut down the very achievements democracy should celebrate. This equality obsession creates what I came to understand as democracy's most dangerous tendency: the systematic reduction of human excellence to the lowest common denominator. I witnessed how democratic societies develop an instinctive hostility toward anything that elevates one person above another. This isn't merely political equality, the reasonable principle that all citizens should have equal rights, but social and intellectual equality carried to absurd extremes. Americans began to view any form of distinction, whether earned through talent, effort, or achievement, as somehow undemocratic. This egalitarian spirit manifests in the persistent suspicion of expertise, the celebration of common opinion over specialized knowledge, and the tendency to treat all viewpoints as equally valid regardless of their foundation in truth or wisdom. I observed how Americans often preferred the judgment of their neighbors to that of genuine authorities, not because the neighbors were necessarily wiser, but because their ordinariness made them seem more trustworthy. The equality trap operates by convincing citizens that excellence itself is a form of oppression. Those who rise above the common level through their abilities or achievements face constant pressure to minimize their distinctions, to apologize for their success, or to demonstrate their fundamental similarity to everyone else. Society develops mechanisms to humble the excellent and elevate the mediocre, creating what we might call a tyranny of the average. I saw this dynamic in American education, where the desire to ensure no child was left behind often meant ensuring no child moved too far ahead. In politics, where candidates learned to hide their intellectual sophistication behind folksy common sense. In culture, where artistic and literary standards were increasingly democratized until excellence became suspect and accessibility became the highest virtue. This leveling impulse extends beyond individual achievement to institutional authority. Democratic societies begin to question not just particular authorities but the very concept of authority itself. Traditional sources of wisdom, whether religious, intellectual, or cultural, find themselves challenged not on their merits but simply because they claim special insight or standing. The result is a society that talks constantly about diversity while enforcing a rigid conformity to mediocrity. True diversity, the diversity of talents, achievements, and insights that make civilization possible, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when the democratic ethos views all forms of distinction as potential threats to equality. Chapter 3: The Atomization of Society, when individualism becomes isolation. Democracy promised to liberate individuals from the artificial constraints of aristocratic hierarchy, yet I discovered it often delivers them into a more subtle prison, the isolation that comes when social bonds dissolve and each person becomes an atom floating in democratic space. This democratic individualism, while containing valuable elements, can metastasize into something that undermines the very social fabric democracy requires to function. In aristocratic societies, individuals were embedded in networks of mutual obligation and dependence. A nobleman had duties to his vassals, just as they had duties to him. These relationships, however unequal, created social cohesion and mutual responsibility. Democracy destroyed these artificial bonds, but what would replace them? I observed that Americans initially filled this void through voluntary associations, those remarkable institutions that brought people together around shared purposes and interests. Yet I also detected warning signs of what could happen when democratic individualism went too far, people withdrawing into purely private concerns, losing interest in public affairs, and breaking the social connections that make democratic governance possible. This atomization manifests in several destructive ways. First, citizens begin to view politics as something that happens to them rather than something they actively participate in creating. They become consumers of governance rather than producers of it, expecting politicians and bureaucrats to manage public affairs while they focus exclusively on their private lives. Second, the social trust that democracy requires begins to erode. When people live increasingly isolated lives, they lose the daily interactions that build mutual understanding and cooperation. They begin to view their fellow citizens as strangers or potential threats rather than as partners in democratic governance. This isolation breeds the suspicion and hostility that make democratic compromise impossible. Third, Democratic individualism can produce a kind of moral relativism where each person's private judgment becomes the final authority on questions of right and wrong. While individual conscience deserves respect, society also needs shared moral foundations that transcend personal preference. When everyone becomes their own moral authority, the common standards necessary for democratic deliberation begin to disappear. I witnessed how this isolation makes citizens vulnerable to demagogues who promise to restore the social connections that individualism has severed. When people feel atomized and alone, they become susceptible to movements that offer them a sense of belonging, even if that belonging comes at the cost of democratic values and institutions. The irony is profound. Democracy liberates individuals from aristocratic constraints only to deliver many of them into a loneliness that makes them long for any authority that will relieve them of the burden of self-governance. The atomized citizen often proves more willing to surrender freedom than the aristocratic subject who never possessed it. Democracy requires citizens who are independent enough to think for themselves but connected enough to care about the common good. When individualism becomes isolation, it undermines both requirements. Chapter 4: The Soft Despotism, Democracy's Unique Form of Tyranny. The tyranny I foresaw emerging in democratic societies would be unlike any the world had previously known. Traditional despotism was harsh but simple. It broke men's wills through violence and terror. Democratic despotism would be far more subtle and perhaps more complete. It would infantilize citizens while convincing them they remained free. This soft despotism doesn't break wills so much as it redirects them toward trivial concerns. It allows citizens to choose their entertainments, their consumer goods, their private pleasures, while gradually removing from their control all the decisions that truly matter. People feel free because they can select from a vast array of options in the marketplace. Yet they exercise no meaningful influence over the forces that shape their society. I envisioned a government that would be absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would spare citizens the trouble of thinking and the pain of living by managing every aspect of social existence. This authority wouldn't tyrannize citizens so much as it would gradually extinguish their capacity for self-governance by making it unnecessary. The mechanism of this soft despotism operates through the expansion of administrative power that claims to serve citizens' needs and protect their welfare. Each expansion of governmental responsibility, however well-intentioned, removes another sphere of life from citizen control. The state becomes a vast network of experts and bureaucrats who understand society's complexities better than ordinary citizens could hope to. Citizens in such a system retain their legal rights while losing their practical power. They can vote, speak, and associate, yet these formal freedoms become increasingly meaningless as real decisions migrate to administrative agencies staffed by experts who claim superior knowledge and technical competence. Democracy becomes a performance staged for citizen spectators rather than a process of genuine self-governance. This despotism gains strength through democratic legitimacy itself. Since it emerges from popular will and operates through elected officials, it appears to embody rather than threaten democratic values. Citizens support the expansion of governmental power because it promises to solve their problems and secure their welfare. They voluntarily surrender their independence in exchange for security and convenience. The soft despot doesn't need to suppress opposition because opposition becomes irrelevant. Political parties may compete, but they compete over how best to manage the administrative state rather than whether such extensive administration is desirable. Citizens may choose between candidates, but the candidates offer only different flavors of the same fundamental approach to governance. I saw the seeds of this development in the American tendency to look to government for solutions to social problems that previous generations would have addressed through family, church, or community action. Each successive governmental intervention created precedent for further intervention, gradually shifting the locus of social responsibility from citizens to experts. The result would be a society of perpetual minors, legally free but practically dependent, formally equal but actually powerless, nominally self-governing but essentially managed by others. Chapter 5: The Death of Civic Spirit, When Democracy Becomes Spectator Sport. Democracy's vitality depends on active citizen participation, yet the very success of democratic institutions can breed a complacency that saps the civic spirit essential to their maintenance. I observed how Americans could become so confident in their democratic system that they stopped participating in the hard work of sustaining it. The health of democracy requires citizens who understand that freedom isn't automatic, it must be continually earned through engagement, sacrifice, and vigilance. Yet I detected signs that Americans were beginning to treat democracy as a machine that would run itself, requiring only periodic maintenance through elections while citizens focused on their private affairs. This civic decline manifests in several troubling ways. First, citizens begin to view political participation as someone else's responsibility. They expect politicians, journalists, and activists to maintain democratic institutions while they pursue their personal interests. Public affairs become a specialized profession rather than a shared civic duty. Second, the quality of political discourse deteriorates when citizens withdraw from serious engagement. Political discussion becomes dominated by those with the strongest ideological commitments rather than those with the deepest understanding. Complexity gets reduced to slogans, and nuanced positions get drowned out by extremist voices that understand how to capture attention in an environment where most citizens pay only casual attention. Third, democratic institutions begin to lose their legitimacy when citizens stop participating in them meaningfully. Elections become contests between competing teams of professionals rather than genuine choices about the direction of society. Legislative deliberation becomes theater performed for media consumption rather than serious debate among representatives who understand they are accountable to engaged constituents. I witnessed how this civic disengagement creates opportunities for demagogues and special interests to capture democratic institutions. When most citizens aren't paying attention, organized minorities can exercise disproportionate influence over public policy. Democracy becomes responsive to the loudest voices rather than the broadest consensus. The irony is that democracy's success in securing citizens' welfare and protecting their rights can eliminate the sense of urgency that motivates civic participation. When people feel safe and prosperous, they naturally turn their attention to private concerns. Yet this withdrawal from public life gradually undermines the very institutions that made their security and prosperity possible. Religious authority, which traditionally motivated civic engagement by teaching citizens their duties to the common good, also weakens in democratic societies. As traditional sources of moral authority decline, citizens lose the frameworks that once convinced them to subordinate private interest to public responsibility. The result is a democracy that continues to function formally while losing its animating spirit. Elections still occur, laws still get passed, and institutions still operate, but the citizen engagement that gives these processes meaning and legitimacy gradually disappears. Democracy becomes a hollow shell maintained by habits rather than convictions. Chapter 6: The False Promise of Equality, How Democratic Ideals Betray Democratic Practice. The tension between equality and freedom that I identified as central to democratic societies reveals itself most destructively when citizens mistake equality of opportunity for equality of outcome, and then demand that government engineer the latter at the expense of the former. This confusion transforms democracy's noblest aspirations into its greatest vulnerabilities. Americans initially understood equality primarily as equal treatment under law and equal opportunity to pursue happiness according to one's abilities and efforts. This form of equality strengthened democracy by ensuring that merit rather than birth determines social position. Yet I foresaw how this reasonable equality could evolve into something far more dangerous: the demand that government ensure equal results regardless of unequal efforts or abilities. This transformation occurs gradually as citizens observe that equal opportunities often produce unequal outcomes. Some individuals succeed while others fail. Some families accumulate wealth while others struggle. Some communities prosper while others stagnate. These inequalities, even when resulting from fair processes, generate resentment among those who fare poorly and guilt among those who succeed. Democratic politicians, always sensitive to popular sentiment, begin promising to reduce these inequalities through governmental intervention. They offer to tax the successful to subsidize the unsuccessful, to regulate markets to ensure fair outcomes, and to redistribute resources according to need rather than merit. Each intervention seems reasonable in isolation, yet collectively they transform democracy from a system that protects equal opportunity into one that attempts to guarantee equal results. This equality project requires ever-expanding governmental power because natural inequalities constantly reassert themselves. People differ in talent, motivation, wisdom, and luck, so equal treatment inevitably produces unequal outcomes. To maintain artificial equality, government must intervene more intrusively in citizens' lives, redistributing not just wealth but opportunities, responsibilities, and even social recognition. The pursuit of outcome equality also corrupts democratic discourse by encouraging citizens to think of politics primarily in terms of group competition for government benefits rather than shared deliberation about the common good. Society fragments into coalitions of people who share similar grievances against the existing distribution of resources and opportunities. Politics becomes a struggle between these factions rather than a process of building consensus around shared principles. Moreover, the Equality Project undermines the moral foundations of democracy by teaching citizens that success and failure result from social arrangements rather than individual choices. If inequality stems from systemic injustice rather than personal responsibility, then those who succeed owe their achievements to luck or exploitation rather than effort and merit. This perspective destroys the work ethic and personal responsibility that make democratic societies prosperous and free. The most insidious aspect of this false equality is how it justifies authoritarianism in democracy's name. If existing inequalities prove that democracy isn't working properly, then extraordinary measures become necessary to make it work correctly. Democratic institutions can be overridden in service of democratic ideals, and individual rights can be violated to serve the collective good. Chapter 7: America's Democratic Crossroads: The Choice Between Freedom and Comfortable Slavery. Today's America stands at the precise crossroads I anticipated when I first studied your democracy in the 1830s. The trends I identified, majority tyranny, equality obsession, civic disengagement, soft despotism, and the confusion of democratic means with democratic ends, have reached a critical mass where they threaten to transform American democracy into something unrecognizable to its founders. The choice facing Americans is stark yet subtle. You can continue down the path toward what I called comfortable slavery, a system that maintains democratic forms while emptying them of democratic substance, or you can revive the civic spirit and institutional wisdom that made American democracy a marvel of the world. The comfortable path leads toward a society where government manages every aspect of life in the name of equality and security, while citizens retreat into private pleasures and consumer choices. This comfortable slavery appeals to many because it promises to solve democracy's most difficult problems without requiring citizens to do the hard work of self-governance. Professional politicians and expert administrators would handle all complex decisions, leaving citizens free to pursue their personal interests without the burden of civic responsibility. Inequality would be minimized through redistribution, conflict would be managed through bureaucratic processes, and social problems would be solved through technical expertise rather than democratic deliberation. Yet this apparent solution destroys democracy's essential character. A system where experts make all important decisions while citizens choose only between consumer options isn't democracy, its administrative despotism wrapped in democratic rhetoric. The fact that citizens initially consent to this arrangement doesn't make it less tyrannical, it makes the tyranny more complete because it eliminates even the desire for freedom. The alternative requires Americans to rediscover what made their democracy exceptional, the understanding that freedom requires responsibility, that equality means equal treatment rather than equal outcomes, that democracy demands active participation rather than passive consumption, and that self-governance is a skill that must be continually practiced to be maintained. This recovery would require Americans to rebuild the intermediary institutions, families, churches, local communities, voluntary associations, that mediate between individuals and the state. These institutions teach the habits of cooperation and compromise essential to democratic life while providing alternatives to governmental solutions for social problems. It would also require Americans to accept that democracy produces inequality and conflict as natural byproducts of freedom, and that attempts to eliminate these inconveniences through governmental intervention ultimately eliminate freedom itself. A mature democracy acknowledges that some problems have no solutions, only trade-offs that citizens must continuously negotiate through democratic processes. Most fundamentally, Americans must choose whether they want to be citizens or subjects, whether they prefer the challenges of freedom or the comfort of dependence, whether they will take responsibility for their democracy or surrender it to experts who promise to manage it for them. This choice cannot be postponed indefinitely. Each day that Americans become more dependent on government and less engaged in civic life, the path back to genuine democracy becomes more difficult to navigate. Conclusion. The dark side of democracy I observed emerging in America wasn't the result of external enemies or accidental failures, it was democracy's own internal logic carried to its natural conclusion. The very qualities that made American democracy admirable contained within them the potential for democratic self-destruction. Yet this diagnosis also contains hope. Because these tendencies emerge from democracy itself rather than from external forces, they can be corrected through democratic means. Americans retain the power to choose freedom over security, responsibility over comfort, civic engagement over private withdrawal. The question is whether they will exercise this power before it's too late. Democracy's window for self-correction isn't infinite. Once citizens become sufficiently dependent on government and disconnected from civic life, the skills and institutions necessary for self-governance atrophy beyond recovery. My observations of America taught me that democracy is not a destination but a journey, one that each generation must undertake anew. The principles that guided your founders remain valid, but they must be continually rediscovered and reapplied to contemporary circumstances. The choice between freedom and comfortable slavery awaits your decision. The future of not just American democracy, but democratic civilization itself, hangs in the balance.